Good day, everyone. My name is Andrew Taylor, and I'm going to be talking about some work we recently published in the journal Biological Conservation, which was part of a larger study on the wildlife ranching sector done between 2014 and 2016. For the purposes of this work, we have defined wildlife ranching as private land enterprises that use wildlife-based land uses to generate income. We do not differentiate between wildlife ranches and game farms because there is no clearly defined difference, although broadly speaking, ranches tend to be bigger, more extensive, and with fewer management interventions, while farms tend to be smaller and more intensively managed. This study encompasses both of these classes of wildlife use, and I will just refer to wildlife ranching. To give a brief history of the sector, before the 1970s, very few farmers kept wildlife on their land because it was viewed as competition for livestock, because it carried diseases, and because it has no financial value. During the 1960s, ecologists started to recognize that wildlife could provide a sustainable source of income, and when legislation gave private landowners user rights over wildlife, landowners started keeping it. The Game Theft Act of 1991 provided even greater incentive to look after wildlife in private land, and this drove a period of huge growth, which has lasted over the last 50 years. So why is wildlife ranching important for conservation? Well, firstly, it covers a very large area. The pie chart represents our best guess at how much land it takes up relative to other land uses. We think it takes up about 15% of the land area of the country, which is larger than the formal protected area network. Wildlife ranching has potential conservation, economic and social benefits, and is a big player in the biodiversity economy. And a key step in developing an effective biodiversity economy is knowing what its components can offer. Our current state of knowledge is outlined in this table. We think there are about 9,000 wildlife ranches covering an area of about 20 million hectares, and we know that about half of these are located in Limpopo. But in fact, we do not have accurate data on any of these things because there is no central database and no one entity keeps accurate national records. We don't know where these properties are all located, and we don't know who does what on their land. In terms of economic contributions, we have disjointed data from different land uses, including hunting and ecotourism, but no reliable data on game meat income, and there are no collated stats. We know very little about profitability and how wildlife ranching compares to other potential land uses. Information on numbers of jobs supported are old, and we have no proper understanding of the contribution to conservation. Based on these knowledge gaps, our objectives were to describe the patterns of land use on wildlife ranches across the country and estimate their financial and social contributions. We do not cover conservation benefits here. We obtained all our data from individual interviews with landowners or managers using a structured pre-tested questionnaire. Because there is no national database, we had to create our own, but because we did not have a full list of all the properties in the country, our sampling could not be truly random. We are therefore cautious about extrapolating too widely from our results. Our criteria for including a property was that it had to generate revenue from wildlife, either as a primary or a secondary source of revenue. We contacted 427 landowners and completed 276 interviews. 99 of the people we contacted were unwilling to participate, and we excluded 52 because they did not use wildlife commercially. The white dots on the map that you see on the right-hand side represent the locations of all participating properties. So first we asked about what land uses all of the landowners practiced. 54% of surveyed properties were exclusively used for wildlife, while the remainder were mixed farms being a combination of wildlife, livestock and crops. It was uncommon for ranchers to rely on one wildlife-based land use alone, and 86% of the surveyed properties conducted 2 or more land uses. In the red ring, you can see that a third of the properties had 4 or more wildlife-based land uses. In terms of what wildlife ranchers are doing on their land, the most common activity was selling live animals, with nearly 70% doing this. Ecotourism, trophy hunting, and biltong hunting were each conducted on about half the surveyed properties. Overall, 80% of properties conducted some form of consumptive use, while intensive breeding was conducted on 46%. And I'll give some quick definitions as we use them in our study. Ecotourism is non-consumptive activities, such as photographic tourism and bird watching. Trophy hunting is the selective hunting of non-domesticated animals, picked for specific traits such as large horns, tusks, and body size. Biltong hunting is the hunting of non-domesticated animals, which are invariably wild ungulate species, performed as a cultural activity by local hunters with the purpose of obtaining meat. And intensive breeding is the confinement of wild species in enclosures or camps where they are fenced in, protected from predators, and provided with most or all of their food, water, and veterinary requirements. The purpose of this breeding is to sell animals live, either for further breeding or for hunting. With regards to intensive breeding, for each property, percentage intensification was calculated as the total intensive area divided by the total property area multiplied by 100. Most properties conducting intensive breeding had less than 10% of their land under camps, but you can see that 14% were completely subdivided into breeding camps. Overall, 5.1% of the surveyed properties, so that's all surveyed properties, were under camps. So moving on to the financial and social aspects of the study, these were the questions that we asked. Rather than directly asking what their profits were, we took a more indirect approach and asked about total revenues and total running costs. That way the participants were able to say no to answering certain questions if they chose, but still provided useful information. Many chose not to divulge financial information, but we did get some useful data. Total operating profit was calculated as the difference between the total annual revenue and the total annual running costs. And the land value was used to estimate return on investment, and hunting offtakes were used to estimate revenues from different land uses. So here we have the results from the revenues, profits, and return on investment. Note the revenue and profit values are in US dollars at 2016 levels, and the exchange rate at the time was about 14-1. The median revenue on wildlife-only properties, so that's on the left, was 104 US dollars per hectare, which equated to about 1,400 Rand per hectare. But there were some revenues much greater than that, and you can see between 500 and almost over 5,000 US dollars per hectare. These very high revenues were for properties conducting intensive breeding. There were fewer data points for profits, but you'll notice that most of the properties were profitable, although a handful were not. About 5 were making a loss. The median profit on wildlife-only properties was 46 US dollars per hectare. But there were a few properties again making very high profits, and again these were intensive breeding properties. We only calculated return on investment for wildlife-only properties, and the median return was 6.8%, but there was a very large amount of variability. These offtake revenues or values were estimated from the offtake data that we obtained from the participants. For each species, the numbers taken off were multiplied by the average hunting or live sale price, which you obtained from the landowner or from websites, and then these were all summed. Note that these are just revenues, but the highest earners were live sales from intensive breeding, followed by trophy hunting and ecotourism. And we did find that when we were able to compare revenues with profits from the previous results, we found that there was a very high correlation. So we think it's fairly safe to say that these revenues would correlate strongly with profits. Moving on to jobs, the median number of permanent jobs supported on wildlife-only properties was 4 per 1,000 hectares, while the mean was 9.7. On mixed farms, the median and mean were 3.1 and 7.7, so they were slightly lower on the mixed farms. For brevity, I'm not going to present the statistics that we ran for this, but we did find that properties conducting ecotourism employed an average of 2.5 times more people than non-ecotourism properties, while properties conducting biltong hunting employed half as many people on average than non-built and hunting properties. These are the estimated weights of game meat from all consumptive use activities per property. We separated them into biomes to simplify a comparison with extensive livestock production, which I'll talk about just now. The red lines show hypothetical meat production from extensive cattle ranching in the different biomes based on estimated maximum and minimum agricultural grazing capacities. You can see that game meat production on most properties is below the theoretical meat production from extensive livestock farms, but that a few wildlife properties are able to match the lower production levels of livestock. Reasons for the variability in game meat production include that management objectives of most landowners are not focused on game meat, and that there are no formal regulations for processing game meat in South Africa, which makes it expensive to comply with current meat hygiene legislation. So how do all these figures compare with livestock farming? Financial and social data for the extensive livestock industry are actually very difficult to find, so we had to estimate our own figures using government reports. There are obviously limitations to these estimates that I don't have time to discuss now, so we present these findings cautiously. In comparison with extensive livestock farming, which we thought would be the next most likely form of land use, mean revenues per hectare were higher on wildlife-only properties than on extensive livestock farms. The mean number of jobs were twice as high on wildlife-only properties compared to livestock farms, but the amount of game meat produced was lower on wildlife-only properties. So in conclusion, wildlife ranching is financially viable on marginal land, creates more jobs than extensive livestock farming, and has potential to be competitive in the meat production sector. The conservation benefits of wildlife ranching still need to be assessed, however, to fully understand the impact of the sector. Thank you very much.